Constantinople, 548 AD. Behind the golden doors of the imperial palace, doctors gather around a bed covered in Tyrian purple, the color worth more than gold, the color only emperors can wear. The woman dying in that bed once performed naked on stage, while geese pecked grain from between her legs. Now she wears a crown that rules half the known world. Empress Theodora opens her eyes one last time. Her husband Justinian cries beside her, the most powerful man on earth reduced to a grieving husband. The courtiers bow their heads. The priests say prayers. But the servants who dress her, who clean her rooms, who know what happens when the palace doors close, they look at each other. They know secrets that would destroy an empire if spoken out loud, because Theodora of Constantinople lived 3 completely different lives. The public saw a religious empress who built churches and protected women. The court knew a political mastermind who ordered thousands killed without blinking. But the servants, the spies, the midnight visitors to her private rooms, they knew something else entirely. This is the story of how a bearkeeper's daughter, who performed unspeakable acts in Constantinople's brothels, became the most powerful woman in Byzantine history. How she changed laws specifically so she could marry an emperor. How she kept a secret network of lovers while married to the most watched man in the empire, and how she managed to die a saint in the Orthodox Church despite living a life that would make modern scandal look tame. The servants preparing her body for burial, notice marks on her skin that shouldn't exist on a faithful wife. They find items hidden in her room that confirm rumors whispered for decades. They discover letters that reveal appetites Procopius, the court historian, called inhuman. But they say nothing because even dead, Theodora remains the most dangerous woman in Constantinople. What you're about to hear comes from 3 sources. First, the official histories that paint Theodora as a changed sinner, turned righteous empress. Second, Procopius's secret history, written in hidden rooms and buried for centuries, containing claims so shocking that scholars still debate whether they can possibly be true. And third, archaeological evidence from the palace itself, recently uncovered, that suggests the secret history might have understated the reality. Fair warning, this isn't just another story of ancient scandal. This is the account of a woman who used her sexuality to climb from the gutter to the throne, who used her body as a political tool while keeping a public appearance of Christian virtue, who satisfied appetites that required architectural changes to the palace itself. If Theodora's contemporaries are to be believed, she didn't just break sexual taboos. She shattered them so completely that Byzantine law had to be rewritten to handle her existence. The year is 500, and in the basement of Constantinople's hippodrome, a bearkeeper's daughter is about to discover that her body is the only currency that matters. Before diving into these forgotten stories of power and corruption, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Little Theodora watches her father die, not from the bear he's training for tomorrow's races at the hippodrome, but from something stupider, a scratch that becomes infected, an infection that rotted his blood. The year is 505. She's maybe 5 years old, and her world is about to fall apart, in ways that will transform her into either the greatest actress or the greatest empress Byzantium ever produced. Possibly both. Her mother's solution is practical in the way that desperation makes people practical. Within a week of the funeral, she's leading Theodora and her sisters through the hippodrome, offering them to whichever team will provide protection. The Greens, who employed her father, reject them publicly. The Blues, their rivals, accept them as an insult to the Greens. This moment, this public embarrassment of 3 girls under age 10, will echo through Byzantine history in ways no one present could imagine. By age 12, Theodora is performing in the theatre, which in 6th century Constantinople is basically legalized prostitution with costumes. The law literally classifies actresses as prostitutes. There's no difference. You dance, you strip, you service whoever pays. The performances happen on stage. The services happen in private rooms behind the theatre. Sometimes the performance is the service, acted out for audiences who pay to watch things that would be illegal if they weren't classified as art. Procopius, Writing decades later in his Secret History, describes young Theodora's specialties with the detailed description of someone who either saw them personally or interviewed people who did. She would lie on stage naked, except for a ribbon around her groin, because full nudity was technically illegal, while servants scattered barley grains across her body. Trained geese would then peck the grains off her, starting at her chest, moving lower, while she performed fake pleasure for the crowd. But here's what makes this more than just ancient pornography. Theodora understood something basic about power in Constantinople. The men watching her humiliate herself were senators, merchants, future emperors. They were revealing their desires, their weaknesses, their secrets. While they thought they were consuming her, she was keeping track of them. Every strange desire was information. Every request was power. Every private session was a deposit in a bank of secrets she would use later. Contemporary accounts, even the hostile ones, agree on certain details. Theodora had unusual intelligence, photographic memory for faces and conversations, and the ability to make any man feel like he was the only person in the room. She spoke multiple languages fluently. She could quote Homer and Aristotle. She understood theology well enough to debate bishops, all while taking off her clothes for money. The details of her work were mathematically staggering. One account claims she serviced 30 men in a single night, then complained she had only 3 openings to work with. Another describes her organizing competitions to see whether she could exhaust entire military units. These numbers are probably exaggerated, but even half would represent a kind of physical endurance that goes beyond normal human ability. By age 16, she had graduated from the common theaters to private parties for the ultra-wealthy. These weren't just orgies, though they were that too. They were networking events where Constantinople's shadow government conducted real business. Trade deals were negotiated over naked bodies. Political alliances were sealed with shared women. Theodora wasn't just present at these negotiations. She was memorizing every detail. The change from actress to courtesan happened through careful selection of clients. She identified men with actual power versus those with just money. She built relationships with their wives, becoming necessary to households as both mistress and friend. She learned which senators took bribes, which generals preferred boys, which bishops visited brothels. Information became her real currency. Her first major relationship was with Hysebulus, the governor of Pentapolis in North Africa. She convinced him to take her as his official mistress, escaping Constantinople's theaters for what seemed like a better life. The relationship lasted 4 years before he abandoned her in Alexandria, penniless and thousands of miles from home. Most women in her position would have returned to prostitution or died. Theodora did something unexpected. She spent a year in Alexandria studying with Christian theologians, not because she found religion, but because she recognized that Christianity was becoming the empire's dominant power structure. She learned monophysite doctrine, the branch of Christianity that would later define her political alliances. She memorized scripture. She built relationships with powerful bishops. She transformed herself from fallen woman to repentant sinner, a story that would prove valuable later. The return journey to Constantinople took her through Antioch, where she may have met Justinian for the first time, though accounts differ. What's certain is that by 522, she was back in Constantinople, no longer performing in theaters, but supporting herself through a suspicious combination of wool spinning and strategic relationships with powerful men. The wool spinning was a cover story. Everyone knew it. But it provided the appearance of respectability she needed for her next move. Something had changed in Theodora during her travels. The woman who returned to Constantinople wasn't the same girl who had left with Hysebulus. She had seen the empire's power structures from the inside. She understood that sex was just one form of currency in a complex economy of influence. She had developed a long-term plan that would have seemed insane if anyone had known about it. She was going to marry into the imperial family. Justinian first saw Theodora at a gathering. He shouldn't have attended in a house he shouldn't have known existed. The year was 522. He was 40 years old, the adopted son of Emperor Justin, celibate by reputation, obsessed with theology and law. She was 22, officially a wool spinner. Unofficially, still the most dangerous woman in Constantinople. What happened in that room changed the course of Western civilization, though accounts differ on whether it was love at first sight or the most calculated seduction in history. The meeting wasn't accidental. Theodora had been planning it for months through go-betweens, who owed her favors from her theater days. She knew Justinian's routines, his interests, his weaknesses. She knew he stayed up all night reading religious writings. She knew he had never taken a wife or even a known mistress. She knew he was brilliant, ambitious, and completely inexperienced with women like her. The standard story says Justinian fell instantly in love, but Procopius offers a different version. He claims Theodora used what he calls pharmakia, which could mean drugs, magic, or simply techniques, learned in brothels that could make any man obsessed. She would have known exactly how to present herself, smart enough to discuss theology, vulnerable enough to trigger his protective instincts, beautiful enough to overwhelm his celibate defenses. Within weeks, Justinian was visiting her constantly. Within months, he was talking about marriage. This created a crisis that nearly toppled the government. Roman law clearly forbade senators from marrying actresses. Not former actresses. Once an actress, always an actress in the eyes of the law. The stain was permanent, hereditary, legally permanent. Justinian's desire to marry Theodora wasn't just scandalous. It was legally impossible. The Empress Euphemia, Justin's wife and Justinian's adopted mother, blocked the union with the kind of anger reserved for protecting family honor. She knew exactly who Theodora was. Everyone did. The woman who had performed with geese, the woman who had exhausted 30 men in one night, the woman whose name was still whispered in Constantinople's brothels as either inspiration or warning. This creature would never wear the imperial purple while Euphemia was alive, so Theodora waited. She kept her relationship with Justinian but made no demands. She positioned herself as the victim of outdated laws and unfair prejudice. She built alliances among the court's women, many of whom had their own complicated pasts. She donated to churches very publicly. She attended services where everyone could see her praying. She performed redemption like she had once performed desire. Euphemia died in 524. Within a year, Justinian had convinced his uncle to change the law. The new legislation was specifically written to allow reformed actresses to marry into the senatorial class. It fooled no one. Everyone knew this law had one beneficiary, Theodora. The empire's legal code was being rewritten for a former prostitute. The wedding in 525 was the event of the century. Theodora wore purple silk worth more than entire provinces. She entered the Hagia Sophia as a reformed sinner. She left as future empress. The transformation was so complete that visiting dignitaries who didn't know her history assumed she came from ancient nobility. Those who did know stayed silent. Theodora had files on half the court from her theater days. When Justin died in 527, Justinian became emperor with Theodora as his co-ruler. Not just empress consort, but Augusta, co-emperor in all but name. She received foreign ambassadors independently. She issued orders with her own seal. She maintained a separate court with its own budget and army of bureaucrats. No woman in Roman history had held such official power. But the private Theodora was supposedly even more shocking than the public empress. Procopius claims she kept her appetites despite the marriage. The palace was changed to include secret passages that allowed visitors to reach her rooms undetected. These weren't architectural features from previous emperors. Construction records show they were added after 527, specifically to Theodora's wing. The list of alleged lovers reads like a who's who of Byzantine society. Generals who suddenly received promotions, bishops who gained wealthy parishes, foreign ambassadors who achieved impossible trade agreements, all had one thing in common: private audiences with the empress that lasted far longer than any official. Business required. The most damning account involves a young man named Ariobindus who supposedly visited Theodora's rooms 3 times a week for 2 years. He was married to Justinian's niece, making the affair doubly dangerous. When he tried to end it, Theodora had him accused of treason. He fled to a monastery. She had him dragged back to Constantinople. He was never seen again. His wife was told he had died of sudden illness. The planning required to keep affairs while married to an emperor required extraordinary planning. Justinian worked obsessively, often through the night, but he also traveled frequently, leaving Theodora to govern in his absence. These windows provided opportunities. The servants were either loyal through love or terror. The guards were hers, not his. The palace became her stage for performances the public would never see. Contemporary accounts describe changes to her private rooms that sound like ancient Roman pleasure gardens. Heated pools with underwater seating designed for specific activities. Mechanical devices imported from India that provided stimulation no human could match. Mirrors arranged to multiply images into infinity. These weren't rumors. The archaeological record shows unusual plumbing and structural supports in what were Theodora's rooms. The question historians struggle with is consent. How many of these encounters were actually affairs versus forced performances by men who couldn't refuse an empress? The power dynamics make any relationship suspect. Could anyone say no to Theodora? Would anyone dare? The public face remained perfect. Theodora attended church daily, sometimes multiple services. She funded convents, commissioned religious art, debated theology with bishops. She passed laws protecting women from forced prostitution, which critics called hypocrisy, given her own past. She increased penalties for trafficking. She created safe houses for reformed prostitutes, all while allegedly maintaining a shadow court devoted to activities that would make her theater days look tame. The contradiction drove observers mad. How could the same woman who ordered the construction of churches be conducting orgies in the palace? How could someone who protected prostitutes be getting them for private use? How could a reformed sinner be committing worse sins with imperial authority? The answer might be that Theodora saw no contradiction. Power was power. Sex was a tool like any other. The same skills that had lifted her from brothel to throne could keep her position once achieved. The body that had been her only currency as a child remained useful as empress. The appetites that had defined her youth didn't disappear with a crown. January 13, 532. Constantinople burns. The Nika riots have been raging for 5 days. Half the city is ash. The Senate is openly discussing Justinian's replacement. In the palace, courtiers pack their valuables ready to flee. The emperor himself stands in his room holding gold and jewels, planning his escape to Heraclea. The empire is collapsing. Then Theodora enters. What happens next depends on which source you believe. The official history says she delivered a stirring speech about preferring death in purple to life in exile. Procopius's public account agrees, but his secret history offers something darker. He claims Theodora didn't just convince Justinian to stay. She planned the entire crisis to eliminate their enemies, then resolved it through mass murder that would make Nero look restrained. The speech itself, recorded by multiple sources, reveals a mind that understood power with frightening clarity. Purple makes a fine shroud, she supposedly said. I will never see the day when I am not called empress. If you wish to flee, Caesar, you have the money. The ships are ready. The sea is open. But consider whether after you have escaped to safety, you would not prefer death to survival. I will stay. I believe in the old saying, royalty is a good burial shroud. Justinian stayed, but more importantly, he gave Theodora control of the response. What followed was not negotiation or compromise. It was organized slaughter disguised as law enforcement. The rioters had gathered in the Hippodrome, the same arena where Theodora had once performed with geese. 30,000 people packed into a space meant for entertainment, now serving as a revolutionary assembly. They had already crowned a new emperor, Hypatius, nephew of the previous emperor Anastasius. They thought they had won. Theodora's solution was elegant in its brutality. She sent the eunuchs with bags of gold to bribe the Blues faction, reminding them that Hypatius was supported by the Greens, their ancient rivals. Division appeared in the crowd. Then she positioned troops at every exit, not obviously casually like they were keeping order. She sent Belisarius and Mundus, her most loyal generals, into the Hippodrome with simple instructions. No survivors. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughterhouse. 30,000 people, mostly civilians, trapped in an arena with no escape. The soldiers worked methodically, starting at the exits, moving inward. The killing took 3 hours. The screaming could be heard across the Bosphorus. But here's what the official histories don't emphasize. Theodora personally selected who would die. She had a list. Not just the riot leaders, but anyone who had ever opposed her, mocked her past, or questioned her marriage. Senators who had laughed at her performances years ago. Merchants who had used her services, then treated her with contempt. Priests who had called her unredeemable. The riot provided cover for personal revenge on a massive scale. In Hibitians and in the senator Anatolius, had once paid to watch her perform with the geese, then publicly called her a whore when she married Justinian. His entire family was in the hippodrome. The merchant Kalinos had refused to sell her silk when she was still an actress, saying she would dirty it. He died trying to climb the arena walls. The priest John had preached that her marriage was invalid in God's eyes. He was found days later, crushed under bodies. The aftermath revealed Theodora's true genius. She didn't just eliminate enemies, she redistributed their wealth to create new allies. Property taken from the dead funded massive building projects, including the new Hagia Sophia. Positions emptied by massacre were filled with her supporters. The reformed prostitutes she protected were given businesses taken from riot victims. She transformed mass murder into economic growth. Contemporary accounts describe her visiting the hippodrome the next day, walking among the bodies not yet cleared. She supposedly identified corpses of men who had used her services years ago, pointing them out to servants, describing in detail what they had requested, what they had paid, how they had treated her. "This one liked to be strangled while he finished," she allegedly said over one senator's body. "Now he knows how it feels." The psychological impact on Constantinople was permanent. The population understood that Theodora would murder 30,000 people rather than give up power. More terrifying, she would enjoy it. The woman they had watched degrade herself for coins now commanded life and death, absolutely. The transformation was complete and horrifying, but Theodora's revenge went beyond simple killing. She created new laws that seemed progressive, but actually served her vendetta. Banning forced prostitution meant she controlled who could practice the trade. Creating safe houses for reformed actresses meant she knew where every potential rival was located. Increasing punishments for trafficking meant she could eliminate anyone who knew her past by charging them after the fact. The rebuilding of Constantinople after the riots followed Theodora's vision, not Justinian's. The new city was designed to prevent future gatherings, wide streets that troops could control, public spaces with multiple exits to prevent trapping crowds. Most importantly, a new palace complex with even more elaborate private quarters for the Empress, including the architectural changes that shocked builders. Workers described building rooms with no windows, but multiple hidden entrances. Pools with heating systems that required constant maintenance by servants who were then transferred to distant provinces. Rooms with acoustic designs that prevented sound from escaping. One builder, writing years later in Alexandria, claimed he was ordered to create a room with restraints built into the walls and floor, disguised as decorative elements. The question of Justinian's knowledge haunts historians. Did he know about Theodora's appetites? Did he participate? Or did he deliberately ignore evidence to maintain the fiction of their Christian marriage? The emperor, who spent nights writing religious writings, while his wife supposedly conducted orgies in adjoining rooms, presents a psychological puzzle that may be unsolvable. Some evidence suggests complicity. Justinian never remarried after Theodora's death. Despite needing heirs, he preserved her rooms exactly as she left them, forbidding anyone from entering. He destroyed documents that might have contained compromising information. He elevated her supporters even after her death, suggesting either genuine love or fear of what they might reveal. The Nika riots transformed Theodora from powerful empress to untouchable ruler. The senators who survived knew she had planned their colleagues' deaths. The merchants understood their wealth existed at her pleasure. The church recognized that their moral authority meant nothing against her will. Constantinople learned that the former prostitute, who had once begged for their coins, would now take their lives without hesitation. Theodora's real power didn't flow through official channels. While Justinian governed the empire through law and bureaucracy, she controlled it through a shadow network that reached from palace bedrooms to monastery cells, from barbarian camps to Persian courts. The woman who had learned to read men's desires in Constantinople's brothels now used that knowledge to build an intelligence system that would make modern spy agencies envious. The network began with the women nobody noticed, servants who cleaned senatorial bedrooms and heard everything, prostitutes who serviced government officials and remembered every word spoken in passion, former actresses Theodora had saved from the streets, now placed in households where they could observe and report. Each woman owed Theodora personally. Their loyalty wasn't to the empire, but to the empress who had lifted them from degradation. The eunuchs formed another layer. Castrated men occupied a unique position in Byzantine society, trusted with women because they couldn't seduce them, but dismissed by men as not fully male. Theodora cultivated them systematically. Narses, her chief eunuch, commanded armies. Scholasticus controlled the palace purse. Each eunuch in her network managed dozens of informants, creating cells that couldn't be fully exposed even if discovered. The intelligence gathered was intensely personal. Senator Strategios preferred very young girls, information Theodora used to supply him with carefully selected options, who reported every preference and pillow confession. Bishop Sergius had a weakness for Syrian wine that loosened his tongue about church politics. General Buzes talked in his sleep, revealing military plans to the courtesan Theodora had placed in his bed. The blackmail material was catalogued with bureaucratic precision. Hidden in the palace were rooms filled with documents that could destroy anyone in Constantinople. Letters proving adultery, financial records showing embezzlement, testimony about preferences that would horrify the public. Theodora didn't always use this information immediately. Sometimes she held it for years, waiting for the perfect moment. Marcus the patrician learned this when he opposed one of Theodora's theological positions in 538. The next day, his wife received an anonymous package containing detailed accounts of his visits to a particular brothel that specialized in services involving multiple young men. The accounts included dates, times, payments, and specific requests that left nothing to imagination. Marcus withdrew his opposition and became Theodora's most vocal supporter in the Senate. The network extended beyond Constantinople. Theodora maintained letters with queens, princesses, and noble women across the known world. These weren't just diplomatic pleasantries. The letters, some of which survive in monastery archives, contain coded intelligence about troop movements, succession plans, and economic weaknesses. The barbarian queen Amalasuntha thought she was writing to a sympathetic friend about her troubles with Gothic nobles. She was actually providing intelligence that Justinian would use to justify invading Italy. The Persian ambassador Zamasp discovered the network's reach when he tried to negotiate a secret treaty with rebel Byzantine generals. Within hours of the meeting, Theodora knew every detail. She didn't expose the plot immediately. Instead, she let it develop, gathering names of every conspirator. Then, at a public banquet, she casually mentioned details only the conspirators could know, watching their faces change as they realized they were already dead. The generals were arrested that night. Zamasp was sent back to Persia with a message. Theodora knew everything. The monasteries provided unexpected intelligence sources. Theodora funded religious communities throughout the empire, particularly those following monophysite doctrine. Monks and nuns, grateful for her protection, reported on local governors, military commanders, and rival religious groups. A monastery in Syria might inform her about Arab tribal movements. A convent in Egypt would report on grain harvests and tax collection. Holy men and women became spies without realizing it. The sexual intelligence was most valuable. Theodora knew exactly who slept with whom in Constantinople. She knew which wives were unfaithful, which husbands preferred boys, which bishops broke their vows nightly. This wasn't moral judging. It was practical power. A senator couldn't oppose her if she could destroy his marriage. A general couldn't rebel if she could expose his preferences to his troops. The recruitment network was particularly sophisticated. When Theodora needed someone eliminated or compromised, she could provide exactly the right temptation. The serious judge who had ruled against her interests suddenly found himself approached by exactly his type. Tall, blonde, speaking accented Greek. The woman was irresistible because Theodora had designed her to be, trained her specifically for this target. Within a month, the judge was reversing his decisions to keep his new mistress happy, not knowing she reported every word to the Empress. Children formed another intelligence layer. Theodora established orphanages throughout Constantinople, staffed by her supporters. The children were educated, trained, and placed in households where they could be useful. A boy might become a secretary to a senator, reading all his letters. A girl might become a lady's maid, observing her mistress's affairs. They all remembered who had saved them from the streets. The architectural intelligence was ingenious. During the rebuilding after the Nika riots, Theodora's architects included listening posts in new construction, hollow columns that carried sound from rooms above, decorative grilles that looked ornamental but allowed observation, floors with gaps that let conversations filter through. The rebuilt Constantinople was a city designed for surveillance, with Theodora at the center of the web. Foreign rulers learned to fear Theodora's reach. The Vandal king Gelimer discovered she had been writing to his wife for years, when Theodora revealed intimate details about their marriage during negotiations. The Frankish king Theodebert found that Theodora knew about his plans to invade Italy before his own generals did. The Gothic king Totila received letters from Theodora containing information about his supporters that could only have come from his inner circle. The financial network was equally complex. Theodora maintained secret accounts throughout the empire, funded by various schemes, confiscated property from enemies, percentages from businesses she protected, tribute from foreign rulers who preferred her friendship to her hostility. The money funded her intelligence network, her architectural projects, and allegedly her private entertainments. The former actress Chrysamalo, now married to a senator, managed Theodora's most sensitive operations. She coordinated the placement of women in strategic positions. She managed the getting of specific types of entertainment for the Empress's private use. She eliminated problems permanently when necessary. Her house near the palace was known as a place where people entered but didn't always leave. The medical intelligence was particularly valuable. Theodora's doctors didn't just treat illness. They reported on it. She knew which officials were dying, which generals were going blind, which senators suffered from conditions that affected their judgment. She could predict succession crises, military failures, and political opportunities based on health intelligence that no one knew she possessed. The architectural changes to Theodora's wing of the palace began immediately after the Nika riots. Officially, they were restoration after fire damage. Actually, they were the physical form of appetites that required specialized infrastructure. The builders were brought from Syria and Egypt, men who didn't speak Greek and couldn't gossip in Constantinople's markets. When construction finished, they were reassigned to frontier fortifications where life expectancy was measured in months. The plans, partially recovered from monastery archives where they were hidden after Theodora's death, show innovations that wouldn't appear in European architecture for another 1,000 years. Hypercaust heating systems that maintained specific temperatures in different rooms, hydraulic mechanisms that could raise and lower platforms, acoustic engineering that could either amplify or completely muffle sound. These weren't standard palace improvements. The main room, which servants privately called the Purple Room, was 60 feet long and 40 feet wide. The ceiling was domed, covered in mirrors of polished silver that created infinite reflections. The floor was heated marble with channels underneath for warm water, maintaining a temperature that made clothing uncomfortable even in winter. The walls contained hidden compartments that could be opened by pressing specific decorative elements, revealing tools that servants would retrieve and clean after each use. The pool complex defied standard Roman bathing architecture. 7 connected pools, each kept at different temperatures with underwater seating carved to support bodies in specific positions. The deepest pool had mechanisms that created artificial currents. Servants who maintained these pools were selected for their inability to speak, either naturally mute or surgically silenced. The private theatre was perhaps most revealing. It could seat 30 people on cushioned platforms, arranged in a circle around a central performance space. Hidden passages allowed performers to enter from multiple directions. The lighting system used hundreds of oil lamps that could be adjusted to create specific moods. A mechanism in the floor could raise a bed from below. This wasn't for watching traditional theatre. Contemporary accounts from servants who survived their service describe scenes that challenge belief. Theodora would host gatherings where Constantinople's elite engaged in activities that would have meant death if performed publicly. Senators' wives discovering appetites they didn't know existed. Generals participating in scenarios that would destroy their military reputation. Bishops breaking every vow while quoting scripture. The getting of people for these gatherings required its own infrastructure. Young people of both genders were acquired through various channels. Some were purchased from traders who didn't ask questions. Others were recruited from the theaters and brothels Theodora had once worked in. Some were children from her orphanages, selected for specific characteristics and trained for particular purposes. The training itself happened in a separate building near the palace, disguised as a school for palace servants. The curriculum included dance, massage, conversation in multiple languages, and specialized physical techniques that aren't fully described in surviving documents. Graduates of this school were marked with a small tattoo, a purple dove, that identified them to those who knew its meaning. The court physician Aetius, writing in code years after Theodora's death, described treating injuries that he couldn't explain through normal palace activities. Torn tissue that suggested extreme insertions, bruising in patterns that indicated specific devices, damage from prolonged positions that normal human anatomy couldn't maintain without assistance. He treated these injuries silently, knowing that questioning them meant disappearing. The supply chains for Theodora's activities reached across the empire. Merchants in Alexandria provided substances that enhanced endurance and sensation. Indian traders brought devices made of ivory and jade, carved in shapes that served specific purposes. Persian suppliers provided oils and ointments with properties that Roman medicine didn't understand. The budget for these acquisitions was hidden in palace maintenance costs. Justinian's knowledge remains the great mystery. His rooms were separated from Theodora's by a single corridor, close enough that sound would carry without the acoustic dampening the architects had installed. He worked through most nights, writing his legal codes and religious writings. Did he not hear? Did he not notice servants moving through the palace at strange hours? Did he not wonder about the architectural changes that cost more than military campaigns? One theory suggests Justinian was an active participant who maintained public ignorance for political reasons. The emperor who wrote laws about sexual morality while his wife violated every principle would represent hypocrisy too total for the empire to survive. Another theory proposes he knew but accepted it as the price of Theodora's political genius. A third suggests he was genuinely oblivious, lost in his books, while his wife transformed the palace into something unprecedented. The dinner parties were legendary among those who attended and survived. Theodora would host 20 to 30 carefully selected guests. The meals began normally with traditional Roman courses, but as wine flowed, specially mixed with herbs that lowered enhanced sensations, the evening would transform. Clothing became optional, then discouraged, then forbidden. Performances would begin, starting with traditional dances that gradually became something else entirely. Senator Priscus, writing in a private letter discovered centuries later, described one such evening. The Empress organized pleasure like a general coordinates battle. Every person knew their role. Every sensation was planned. Every combination was deliberate. I participated in acts I cannot name with people I see daily in the Senate. We are all bound now by shared shame that ensures mutual silence. The games Theodora invented went beyond simple physical pleasure. She created elaborate scenarios that combined power, humiliation, and release. A judge who had ruled against her might find himself in a position of complete submission to someone he had sentenced. A general who prided himself on control would be restrained and subjected to experiences that shattered his self-image. A bishop who preached against flesh would discover appetites that contradicted every sermon. The psychological manipulation was masterful. Theodora understood that physical pleasure was temporary, but psychological transformation was permanent. She didn't just want bodies. She wanted to fundamentally alter how Constantinople's elite understood themselves. A senator who had experienced submission to a former prostitute could never again believe in natural hierarchy. A general who had begged for release from a 20-year-old boy could never again command with the same authority. Every morning at dawn, Theodora attended divine liturgy at the Hagia Sophia. She stood in the imperial gallery, visible to thousands of worshippers, the perfect image of Christian devotion. Her purple robes covered her from neck to floor. Her head was veiled. Her hands held jeweled gospel books worth more than provinces. She was the defender of monophysite Christianity, the protector of persecuted monks, the builder of churches. She was also, according to the whispers that nobody dared speak aloud, conducting activities in the palace that would make pagan orgies look restrained. The contradiction wasn't just personal hypocrisy. It was a systematic use of religious authority for decidedly unreligious purposes. Theodora understood that controlling the church meant controlling the interpretation of morality itself. If she could define what was holy, she could also define what was permissible. The woman who had once performed with geese now decided which bishops received appointments. Her support for Monophysite Christianity against Orthodox doctrine wasn't theological conviction. It was strategic positioning. The Monophysites were persecuted, marginalized, and desperately needed powerful protection. In exchange for that protection, they provided absolute loyalty. Monks and bishops who owed their survival to Theodora wouldn't question her private activities. They couldn't afford to. The monastery of St. Simeon in Syria received massive donations from Theodora, enough to rebuild entirely after an earthquake. The abbot, a man named Sergius who had fled Orthodox persecution, wrote letters of gratitude that border on worship. He called her the new Mary, God's chosen vessel, holier than the saints. He also supplied her with young novices who were transferred to Constantinople for special theological training and were never seen again. The convent of St. Catherine in Alexandria was another beneficiary of Theodora's generosity. The abbess Maria had been a prostitute in Constantinople before finding religion. She understood exactly who her patron was and what was expected. When Theodora requested pure vessels for holy work, Maria knew to send her most beautiful young nuns, girls who had joined the convent to escape poverty, and were about to discover that God's service took unusual forms. Bishop Anthemius of Constantinople owed his position entirely to Theodora. She had elevated him from obscurity, despite his questionable theology, and even more questionable personal life. In exchange, he provided religious cover for her activities. When senators questioned palace morality, Anthemius would preach about the danger of false witness. When rumors spread about the empress's appetites, he would condemn gossiping as a mortal sin. He transformed the pulpit into Theodora's public relations department. The theological debates Theodora engaged in were performances of a different kind. She would summon bishops to discuss the nature of Christ, the interpretation of Scripture, the requirements for salvation. These discussions would last hours, with Theodora demonstrating encyclopedic knowledge of patristic writings. Then, after establishing her religious credentials, she would retire to rooms where activities occurred that every religious text condemned. The pilgrimage industry became another tool for Theodora's purposes. She funded hostels for pilgrims traveling to holy sites, staffed by her supporters. These hostels served multiple functions. They gathered intelligence about religious movements throughout the empire. They identified potential recruits for her various networks. And sometimes, particularly attractive or useful pilgrims would be diverted to Constantinople for audiences with the empress that had nothing to do with religious devotion, the holy relics. Trade provided cover for even darker activities. Theodora was known as a passionate collector of saints' bones, fragments of the true cross, and other sacred objects. Merchants who supplied these relics often brought other cargo. Hidden among legitimate religious artifacts were items of decidedly unholy purpose: devices from India, substances from Persia, manuscripts from Egypt, describing practices that predated Christianity by millennia. Her charitable works, extensively documented in official histories, had shadow purposes. The hospital she established for reformed prostitutes wasn't just mercy. It was a recruitment center. Women who had nowhere else to go were given food, shelter, and protection. In exchange, some were selected for special service. They couldn't refuse. Where else would they go? The street meant death. The palace meant survival, even if survival required participating in scenarios that reminded them why they had tried to reform. The orphanages followed similar patterns. Children saved from starvation were educated, trained, and evaluated. Most received legitimate education and were placed in normal households. But some, those with particular beauty or talents, were directed toward different futures. By the time they understood what was expected of them, they were too dependent on palace support to refuse. Confession became intelligence gathering. Theodora's personal confessor, a priest named John who owed his position to her influence, heard the secrets of Constantinople's elite. The sanctity of confession meant nothing when the empress's interests were involved. Senators confessing adultery would find their wives receiving anonymous letters. Generals admitting embezzlement would face sudden audits. The confessional booth became a listening post for the palace. The religious art Theodora commissioned contained hidden meanings visible only to initiates. The mosaic of her in the Hagia Sophia, still visible today, shows her holding a chalice. Officially, it represents the Eucharist, but the gems on the chalice are arranged in patterns that correspond to astronomical configurations used in mystery religions. The fold of her robe contains symbols that predate Christianity. She embedded pagan imagery in Christian art, hiding in plain sight. The monasteries she founded in remote locations served purposes beyond prayer. The monastery at Bithynia, accessible only by a single mountain path, was where problems disappeared. People who knew too much, who had seen too much, who had participated in too much, would be sent there for spiritual contemplation. They never returned. The monks maintained strict silence about their permanent residence. Her theological writings, praised by contemporary scholars for their sophistication, contain coded messages when read with the right knowledge. Passages about the unity of divine nature could also be read as instructions for unifying physical bodies in specific configurations. Discussions of spiritual ecstasy described techniques that had nothing to do with prayer. She wrote religious texts that were simultaneously sex manuals, hiding forbidden knowledge in holy words. The feast days she established followed patterns that make sense only when understanding her true purposes. She created celebrations that required night vigils, when darkness provided cover for activities. She instituted fasts that required specific dietary restrictions that coincidentally enhanced physical sensitivity. She scheduled religious festivals that brought specific types of people to Constantinople at convenient times. Not everyone who entered Theodora's private world left it alive. The empress, who had risen from brothel to throne, understood that some secrets were too dangerous to trust to blackmail or bribes. Some people had to disappear completely. The methods she employed combined Byzantine sophistication with brothel pragmatism, creating an elimination system that left no traces, no martyrs, and no questions. The architect Anthemius of Tralles designed more than the Hagia Sophia's revolutionary dome. He created rooms in the palace with special properties, rooms where the air could be slowly replaced with other gases, pools with hidden currents that could exhaust even strong swimmers, floors with mechanisms that could open into shafts leading to underground rivers. He built execution rooms that looked like pleasure rooms, where death could arrive in the midst of ecstasy. Senator Photius discovered this when he tried to blackmail Theodora with evidence of her continued activities. He had somehow acquired documents, possibly from a servant, that detailed specific gatherings and participants. He made the mistake of requesting a private audience to discuss matters of mutual interest. Theodora agreed immediately. The meeting took place in one of her reception rooms, beautifully appointed with silk cushions and Syrian wine. Photius presented his evidence, confident he was about to become very wealthy. Theodora listened calmly, even seemed amused. She offered him wine, which he accepted. She suggested they discuss terms in more comfortable surroundings. He followed her to an inner room, already calculating his demands. The wine contained a paralytic derived from Indian plants, slow-acting but irreversible. As Photius negotiated, his extremities began to tingle. By the time he realized something was wrong, he couldn't move his legs. Theodora continued talking as if nothing was happening, discussing payment schedules while he gradually lost all motor function. When he could only move his eyes, she explained his situation. He would be listed as having left Constantinople on urgent business. His family would receive letters in his handwriting, forged by palace scribes, explaining extended absence. Meanwhile, he would remain in a special wing of the palace, paralyzed but conscious, kept alive by servants who couldn't speak, watching through windows as life continued without him. He lived another 3 years in that state, fully aware but unable to communicate, before finally dying of what appeared to be natural causes. The actress Macedonia had been Theodora's rival in their theater days, competing for the same wealthy patrons. She made the error of arriving in Constantinople years later, thinking old rivalries were forgotten. She was welcomed warmly, invited to a private dinner to reminisce about old times. She left that dinner changed. Theodora had surgeons who could perform modifications that weren't immediately visible, but profoundly altered experience. Macedonia discovered over following weeks that she could no longer experience physical pleasure of any kind. Nerve pathways had been severed with precision that left her functional but sensationless. She lived another 20 years unable to feel touch, taste, or sexual sensation, a particularly cruel fate for someone who had lived through her body. Bishop Constantine had opposed Theodora's theological positions too vigorously, calling her a heretic in what he thought was private correspondence. He was invited to the palace for theological debate. During the discussion, he was offered refreshments. The next morning, he woke to discover his voice destroyed. Not gone, but altered to a high, ridiculous squeak that made his sermons sound like comedy. Physicians could find no cause. He spent his remaining years unable to preach without audiences laughing. The merchant Sabatius had supplied young slaves to the palace for years before developing conscience or greed. He threatened to reveal his dealings unless payments increased dramatically. He received an invitation to discuss new arrangements. He arrived at the palace but never left. His body was never found. His family was told he had sailed for India on sudden business. His wealth was gradually transferred to them through go-betweens, keeping them comfortable and quiet. The elimination methods weren't always physical. Theodora perfected techniques for destroying minds while leaving bodies intact. Senator Eugenius opposed her policies once too often. He began experiencing visions, horrifying hallucinations that physicians couldn't explain. Unknown to him, servants were adding substances to his food that caused progressive brain damage. Within a year, he was completely insane, seeing demons everywhere, unable to tell reality from nightmare. His ravings about Theodora's evil were dismissed as madness. The network of elimination extended beyond Constantinople. Governors who discovered too much died of sudden illnesses. Generals who questioned orders suffered accidents. Foreign ambassadors who saw what they shouldn't vanished during travels. Each death looked natural, accidental, or at least unconnected to the palace. Theodora had physicians who could fake any disease, engineers who could arrange any accident, and assassins who could reach anyone. The female victims often faced specialized fates. Theodora seemed to take particular pleasure in destroying women who reminded her of her past or threatened her present. A young actress who performed the same goose routine Theodora had once done was found months later, alive but modified. Her body had been surgically altered in ways that made performing anything impossible. She became a warning to others who might trade on Theodora's former reputation. The noblewoman Julia had mocked Theodora's low birth at a court function, making jokes about bears and geese. She was invited for a private reconciliation. She left that meeting looking normal, but was fundamentally changed. She had been conditioned through methods that remain unclear to experience violent physical reactions to luxury items. Silk against her skin caused burning sensations. Gold jewelry created nausea. Fine foods tasted like rot. She spent her remaining years unable to enjoy any of the privileges of her class, living in voluntary poverty to avoid constant agony. The record-keeping for these eliminations was careful but coded. Hidden in the palace archives were documents that appeared to be routine administrative records, but actually tracked every disappearance. Names were replaced with numbers. Methods were described in terms that seemed medical, but had different meanings. A casual reader would see healthcare records. Someone who knew the code would see a catalogue of sophisticated murder. AD arrived with spring warmth, and Theodora dying by degrees. The cancer, probably ovarian, though physicians couldn't be certain, had been growing for 2 years. She had hidden it masterfully, using makeup to disguise the yellowing skin, padding to hide the weight loss and sheer will to maintain public appearances. But by March, even she couldn't pretend anymore. The Empress, who had performed impossible acts on stage, was giving her final performance, and she knew the ending. The preparations for death were as elaborate as anything she had organized in life. Documents were burned in palace furnaces for 3 straight days. Witnesses saw cartloads of papers, possibly the blackmail files she had maintained for decades, reduced to ash. Certain servants disappeared, transferred to distant provinces, or simply vanishing entirely. Others were promoted to positions that ensured their silence through complicity. She summoned specific people for final audiences. Some emerged weeping, others terrified, a few seemingly relieved. Senator Marcus left her room pale and shaking, immediately departed for his estates and never returned to Constantinople. Bishop Menas spent 4 hours with her, and emerged looking decades older. The details of these conversations were never recorded, but their effects rippled through Byzantine society for generations. The medical treatment she received was extraordinary, even by imperial standards. Physicians from Alexandria, Antioch, and even India attended her. They tried everything. Herbs that came from beyond the known world, surgical procedures that wouldn't be rediscovered for centuries, treatments that seemed more magical than medical. Nothing worked. The cancer had spread everywhere, consuming her from within like she had once consumed men. But even dying, Theodora maintained her appetites, or at least the performance of them. Servants reported sounds from her rooms that suggested activities impossible for someone in her condition. Whether these were real or staged for some final purpose remains unknown. Perhaps she wanted observers to believe she remained dangerous even while dying. Perhaps the appetites that had defined her were stronger than death itself. Justinian's behavior during her final months revealed either genuine love or genuine terror. He spent every moment not required for governance at her bedside. He wept openly, something emperors never did. He offered anything, promising God he would build 100 churches if Theodora recovered. He even suggested giving up the throne if it would somehow save her. She reportedly laughed at this, saying purple made a good shroud for both of them. The deathbed confession that everyone expected never came. Priests attended her constantly, offering opportunities for final repentance. She confessed nothing beyond standard sins. No mention of the geese, the orgies, the eliminations, the networks of corruption and flesh she had maintained. She performed Christianity perfectly to the end, receiving last rites with apparent devotion, calling on Christ and the Virgin, dying as purely as any saint. June 28th, the end came, but even this was planned. She chose to die at dawn, as purple light entered through windows she had positioned specifically for this moment. The court assembled in careful order. Justinian held her right hand. Her allies held vigil. Her enemies, those who survived, were required to attend and mourn. She had scripted even grief. The last words reported by multiple sources, though they differ in detail, were either "I regret nothing" or "purple is sufficient." Both sound like her. Both were probably true. She closed her eyes as the sun rose fully, purple light giving way to gold, the transformation complete. The bear keeper's daughter, who had performed with geese, died as the most powerful woman in Byzantine history. The funeral surpassed anything Constantinople had seen. Justinian spared no expense, though expense hardly describes it. The procession stretched for miles. Every church bell in the city rang continuously for 3 days. The body, preserved with techniques learned from Egypt, was displayed in purple robes that cost more than armies. The crowd that gathered was larger than for any emperor's funeral. Some came to mourn, others to confirm she was actually dead. But the funeral was also carefully controlled. The body was displayed at distances that prevented close inspection. The pallbearers were her most loyal servants, men and women who knew what secrets to keep. The burial itself was private, with only Justinian and selected officials present. The tomb was sealed with mechanisms that would prevent opening. Whatever Theodora took to her grave would stay there. The immediate aftermath revealed her lasting power. Documents she had prepared were released on schedule. Some elevated allies to positions they would hold for life. Others destroyed enemies who thought her death meant freedom. A senator who had celebrated too openly was found dead within a week, poisoned by methods Theodora had perfected. Even dead, she could kill. Justinian's transformation after her death suggested the depth of her influence. He never remarried despite desperate need for heirs. He preserved her rooms exactly as she left them, forbidding anyone to enter. He continued policies she had established, even when advisors begged him to change. He built churches in her memory that bankrupted the treasury. He mourned her for 17 years until his own death, never recovering the energy that had defined his early reign. The systematic destruction of evidence began immediately. Servants who knew too much disappeared or died in various accidents. Documents that might have contained compromising information vanished from archives. Buildings were torn down and rebuilt to eliminate architectural evidence. The purple room with its mirrors and mechanisms was sealed, then filled with concrete, then built over entirely. Whatever happened there was literally buried. But some evidence survived. Hidden documents in monastery walls, archaeological remains that don't match official records, stories passed through generations of servants, coded messages in art and architecture. The truth about Theodora was too large, too complex, too woven into Byzantine society to completely erase. She had made herself essential to too many systems. Her elimination would have required eliminating Constantinople itself. 100 years after Theodora's death, workers renovating the Hagia Sophia discovered a sealed room behind the imperial gallery. Inside were documents that had been hidden, possibly on the night of her death. The papers were removed, studied briefly by church officials, then destroyed on orders from the Patriarch. But one worker, literate and curious, had read portions before their destruction. His account, recorded by his grandson decades later, described lists of names with acts beside them that would make demons blush. The archaeological evidence continues to emerge even today. Excavations beneath Istanbul regularly uncover Byzantine remains. In 1993, construction workers found a complex of rooms that didn't match any known palace plans. The arrangement suggested specialized purposes: pools with unusual shapes, rooms with mounting points for equipment that wasn't identified, underground passages that connected to multiple buildings. The site was documented, then covered again for a future that hasn't yet arrived. Modern forensic analysis of surviving Byzantine skeletons reveals patterns that historians struggle to explain. Multiple female skeletons from the palace area show signs of repeated trauma consistent with extended restraint. Male skeletons from the same period display damage suggesting prolonged positions that normal anatomy wouldn't voluntarily maintain. These remains tell stories that written records tried to silence. The artistic legacy is equally revealing. Byzantine mosaics from Theodora's period contain imagery that seems standard until examined closely. Figures in backgrounds engaged in acts that become visible only at certain angles. Decorative patterns that form different images when viewed from specific positions. Christian saints with expressions that suggest ecstasy rather than devotion. The artists were encoding what they couldn't openly depict. Procopius's secret history itself raises questions that may never be answered. If even half of what he wrote was true, Theodora was history's most successful sexual predator, using imperial power to satisfy appetites that required architectural modification to accommodate. If it was all lies, why did no contemporary dispute it? Why did Justinian never refute accusations that painted his beloved wife as a monster? Why did the Byzantine establishment accept the text's existence without challenge? The medical texts from the period contain descriptions that support some of Procopius's claims. Physicians describe treating injuries they attribute to palace activities without elaboration. They reference substances imported for imperial use that had no medical purpose. They document physical modifications performed on healthy individuals for reasons they don't explain. The medical evidence suggests something was happening that required professional treatment. The financial records reveal enormous spending that official histories can't explain. Money spent on construction that produced no visible buildings. Payments to merchants who supposedly supplied common goods at extraordinary prices. Salaries for servants whose duties were never specified. The economics of Theodora's reign include a shadow budget that funded something requiring massive resources. The religious implications remain debated. How did a woman living the life Procopius describes maintain support from religious leaders? Were they all compromised by blackmail? Were some willing participants? Did they see her charity work as outweighing her private conduct? Or did they, like everyone else, simply fear opposing someone who could eliminate enemies with such sophisticated efficiency? The genetic studies of modern populations provide unexpected insights. Certain genetic markers associated with Byzantine nobility appear in populations that shouldn't have them according to official genealogies. The suggestion is that Theodora's practice of using sex as politics created bloodlines that official history doesn't acknowledge. Constantinople's elite may have been more intimately connected than anyone admitted. The influence on later Byzantine culture was profound but hidden. The elaborate court ceremonies that developed after Theodora's death included elements that make sense only as references to her practices. The positioning of courtiers in specific arrangements, the use of purple in ways that violated previous tradition, the incorporation of movements that seemed religious but derived from other sources. The Byzantine court was performing rituals whose origins they didn't understand or wouldn't acknowledge. The legal codes Justinian created with Theodora's influence contained provisions that seemed progressive but served specific purposes. Laws protecting prostitutes gave Theodora control over the sex trade. Laws about marriage legitimacy allowed her to eliminate rivals through technicalities. Laws about property inheritance could be used as weapons against enemies. The Justinian Code, foundation of Western law, was partially written by a woman who had performed with geese. The architectural influence extended beyond Constantinople. Churches built during Theodora's reign across the empire contain design elements that don't match standard Byzantine architecture. Hidden rooms that serve no religious purpose. Passages that connected to buildings that no longer exist. Decorative elements that become obscene when shadows fall at certain angles. Theodora left her mark in stone across 3 continents. The woman in the purple shroud was buried with ceremonies that proclaimed her a saint, but the servants who prepared her body knew better. They saw the marks that shouldn't exist on a faithful wife's skin. They found the items hidden in her rooms that confirmed decades of rumors. They discovered the documents that revealed appetites even Procopius hadn't imagined. But they said nothing, because even dead, Theodora remained the most dangerous woman in Constantinople. History has tried for 1,500 years to categorize Theodora, saint or sinner, reformer or predator, faithful wife or insatiable appetite. The truth is that she was all of these simultaneously, a human contradiction that expanded the definition of what a single person could be. She was the bearkeeper's daughter who became empress, the prostitute who became saint, the performer who directed the empire, the woman who transformed her body from commodity to weapon to throne. The facts that can be verified are remarkable enough. She rose from the absolute bottom of Byzantine society to its peak. She changed laws specifically to enable her marriage. She saved Justinian's throne during the Nika riots. She influenced legal codes that still shape Western law. She built churches that still stand. She protected women while allegedly exploiting them. She promoted religious tolerance while practicing intolerance. She was simultaneously the most powerful and most notorious woman of her age. The allegations, if true, reveal something darker. A woman who used systematic sexual predation as a tool of governance, who maintained networks of getting people and blackmail that touched every level of society, who modified the palace to handle appetites that required architectural support, who eliminated threats with methods that suggested deep understanding of human psychology and physiology, who performed Christianity publicly while practicing something ancient and forbidden privately. But perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that everything was performance. That the girl who learned to fake ecstasy for paying audiences never stopped performing. That every appetite was calculated for effect. That every scandal was strategic. That she created a persona so overwhelming that no one could see the real person beneath. That the greatest actress of the Byzantine stage played a role for 40 years without ever breaking character. Modern Istanbul has built over most of Byzantine Constantinople. The palace is gone, its secrets buried beneath centuries of construction. The documents that might have revealed truth were destroyed by people with interests in maintaining mystery. The witnesses are 15 centuries dead. What remains are fragments, architectural oddities, medical descriptions, financial records, and Procopius's allegations that seem too extreme to be true, but too specific to be complete fiction. Theodora won in the end. She died in purple as she had promised. She was buried as empress, not actress. She is remembered as saint by the Orthodox Church that would have condemned her lifestyle. Her mosaic in the Hagia Sophia shows her as she wanted to be seen, regal, pure, holding the chalice of Christ. The bearkeeper's daughter who performed with geese achieved the ultimate transformation. But the servants knew. The workers who found the sealed rooms knew. The physicians who treated unexplainable injuries knew. The architects who built impossible rooms knew. The merchants who supplied unnameable items knew. The senators who attended certain gatherings knew. The bishops who owed their positions to her protection knew. They all knew. And they all stayed silent, because Theodora had taught Constantinople that silence was survival. The purple shroud that covered her body was worth more than most kingdoms. It was the same color as the bruises she had once displayed on stage, performing suffering for coins. The same color as the birthmarks that identified her in the brothel. The same color as the dye that stained her fingers when she tried legitimate work. Purple had been the color of her degradation, and she made it the color of her triumph. She didn't just wear purple, she became it. Justinian never recovered from her death. He ruled 17 more years, but as a shadow of himself. He built churches obsessively, as if architecture could resurrect her. He preserved her rooms like a shrine, though what he was worshipping remains unclear. He never remarried, though the empire needed heirs. He died calling her name, reaching for someone who had been gone nearly 2 decades. Whatever she had been to him, it was irreplaceable. The empire never saw another Theodora. Later empresses were either too pure to be effective or too corrupt to maintain power. None achieved her balance of public virtue and private vice, political genius and personal degradation, Christian charity and pagan appetite. She had been unique, unrepeatable, a coming together of circumstances that created something history couldn't classify or replicate. The final accounting is impossible. How many died for her pleasure? How many lived in her debt? How many bloodlines carry her genetic legacy through unacknowledged connections? How many buildings contain her architectural secrets? How many laws reflect her influence? How many saints owed their canonization to her protection? The questions multiply infinitely, like the mirrors in her purple room. She remains history's most successful contradiction. The prostitute saint, the reformed sinner who never reformed, the faithful wife who maintained a network of lovers, the Christian empress who practiced older religions, the protector of women who exploited them, the builder of churches who modified the palace for obscene purposes, the woman who rose from nothing to everything without ever explaining how. Every biographer who attempts to capture Theodora discovers what the servants who prepared her body learned. There were multiple Theodoras, layered like Russian dolls, each containing another version that contradicted the last. The actress contained the prostitute. The prostitute contained the empress. The empress contained the saint. The saint contained something that predated Christianity, older and hungrier than anything Rome had imagined. The purple light that filled her death room that final morning wasn't just dawn. It was the color she had conquered, worn become. She had taken the symbol of imperial power and made it inseparable from her story. Every emperor after her wore purple that carried her memory. Every ceremony that used purple invoked her ghost. Every piece of purple silk traded in Byzantine markets whispered her name. She died as she had lived, performing, calculating, overwhelming, and never, ever apologizing. The bearkeeper's daughter, who had discovered that her body was currency, had purchased an empire with it. The actress who had learned to fake pleasure had given an emperor genuine happiness. The prostitute who had serviced 30 men in a night had transformed into a saint venerated by millions. History would remember her as Justinian's wife, as if that was her primary identity. But Theodora was never primarily anyone's anything. She was herself, unprecedented and unrepeatable, a force that bent reality around her will until purple itself meant Theodora more than emperor. She had won a game no one else knew was being played, by rules she wrote as she went, for stakes that included the memory of civilization itself. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.